You're listening to the Exploration Films podcast, a deep dive into films from around the world. Conversations with producers, directors, and actors, where they discuss the behind-the-scenes stories of filmmaking and also reflect on their motivations and their worldview as storytellers. Hosted by Renaissance man, sage, and thinker, Carl Moeller.
Well, I am thrilled today to be joined by Steve Greisen of Exploration Films. Steve, welcome.
Thank you.
And we are totally excited to have Charles Denler with us as well. Charles has been someone whose work that I've admired, and I know, Steve, you have because of this incredible project, The Portraits of Colorado. Amazing stuff. Welcome both you guys.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Good to be with you, Charlie, too.
Yeah,
same here.
Well, Charles, you don't look like a classical composer. I think I had some picture in my head of Beethoven walking in or something like that.
Yes. Then I'd be dead.
So, Colorado native, tell me a little of your story from here.
So I'm actually not a native. We moved here about 15 years ago.
Okay.
From Connecticut. I'm a Yankee, and proud to be a Yankee. I grew up in Connecticut, and so what brought us here? I was working a lot out of L.A., so we decided that rather than live in L.A., we'd move to Denver and just I could commute, and I had a studio on Santa Monica and Gower out there. So honestly, the main draw for us anyhow for Colorado was with our kids and the environment and the Christian environment here and just how friendly the people are. Just that was a huge draw.
Huge draw, for sure. And Steve, how did you guys meet?
I'm almost embarrassed to say we met in a mall because I hate malls and I try to never go to them. But it must have been the end of the year or something, and I was jamming for a last-minute gift. But I'm in this giant mall in South Denver, and I'm hearing this guy who's just playing this Celtic kind of electrified violin. It's real warm, really kind of cool. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm going to talk to this guy because, this is the kind of stuff that you could use for soundtrack stuff or transition little moments in film. Well, I had the conversation with the guy, and he didn't really get it. I could tell. But we finished our conversation, and I went walking down to the mall, and I heard someone running up behind me, and I turned around, and here's Charles. And he's with his beautiful daughter, Mariah, who's probably 11 at this point. He goes, hey, I didn't mean to be listening in to the conversation, but he said, are you a filmmaker? And I said, well, we do documentaries. And so he handed me his card, and he said, I do film scores, and I'd love to talk to you about that. Well, I went home, and a little embarrassingly, I threw it in the round file that we call the trash, because if I've heard this once, I've heard it 100 times, and you don't know who's legit, who's not legit. And so a year passes, and I get an email from Charlie saying, we met in the mall. Could we meet? And so we set up a meeting in Castle Rock, which is sort of halfway. He's up in Denver. I'm down in Colorado Springs, kind of halfway. And we arranged to meet at a coffee shop. And that day, this enormous blizzard closes the freeways, and we can't go anywhere. And we communicated and said, we're going to have to do this another time. And so I remember thinking to myself, well, kind of all in God's time if it's supposed to happen. So a year later, after that, I get another email. Hey, I met you in a mall. And God bless Charles for his persistence.
So you followed.
He did. And so we arranged a meeting, and we ended up in the same coffee shop in Castle Rock we were originally going to meet, hit it off, and really had a great discussion and got to know each other. And I felt like, with Charles, I got a brother from another mother. We had a lot in common. Our journeys were common. We were both working in film and different ends of the story. And, as I drilled down and got to know more, here was a guy with legitimate chops that did great work. And I was on my way when we were having that coffee shop meeting. The next day, I was flying to Canada to do this story on this guy that had been interacting with wild bears, a very unusual and kind of weird story. And I thought to myself, with documentaries, you don't know what the story sometimes is. You might think you have an idea. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's not. So I said, I don't even know what we're going to bring back here. But maybe this is the first one we work on together. And so Charlie did the score for that film. It's called The Gentle Bear Man of Emo.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a wonderful story. And Charlie's approach was so great because here was a guy that was really connected to the earth. I mean, he was an earth guy if there ever was one. He worked with his hands. He was a landscaper. It's these animals that rescued this guy. So what Charlie's approach was, he was a simple man. So all the instruments that Charlie used were simple, earthy, flutes, wood guitars, things that reflected sort of this earthiness. And, I saw a great deal of intelligence and beauty in his work. And so that was actually how we got started together, and we've done a bunch more since.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that film was also really profoundly interesting, and the music behind it really did help, bring out the story, and I think it was really something. Looking, again, I'm just curious, Charles, you don't strike me, as I said, as a classical composer. You look more like a guy who'd be into some sort of, LA scene rock kind of stuff. So, true. Okay. How did you get into classical composing symphonies even?
That's interesting because I'm not classically trained, and almost proud of that fact, that I'm not classically trained, and I didn't study orchestration. I didn't study formally. But for some reason, the expression of that style, more of a neoclassical style, was the only thing that really embodied what I felt when I look at God's creation. And when I, a rock song or, I'm a little more jazz sort of pop. But for some reason, that didn't really reflect what I was seeing around me. And for me, being out in God's creation is the most worshipful aspect. For me, more than going to a church service or more than engaging in that way. For me, when I'm out and I'm running along a river or a lake, I really feel God's presence. Yeah. And so my quest was, how do I create music that is a true reflection of God's majesty? And honestly, it just didn't come through rock. It just didn't come through jazz. The only medium was sort of using an orchestra and big over-the-top orchestral music. So it was more by default. And that's sort of where my music fell in films. Before Steve and I met, I was writing a lot for National Geographic and for History Channel, and they generally wanted these big sort of over-the-top orchestral scores behind the drama that was sort of unfolding. So it was sort of the natural progression was into the classical world. So who would you say has influenced you in that sort of musical style? Aaron Copland. Sure. Certainly he embodies Americana, and music is absolutely amazing. And, even in the classical world, they play Aaron Copland, but he might be a little too sort of pop classical for some people. Philip Glass, I love Philip Glass and sort of his minimalist approach. And then Ennio Morricone, he did the score for a film called The Mission. Love that movie. Yeah, and one of his most famous pieces is Gabriel's Oboe, which is this incredible oboe solo with the orchestra, and huge influences. Wow. And I think a lot of your music, when I listen to it, does evoke that sort of big picture of America, but also the sorts of grand storytelling that comes with big orchestration and all of that. It's very moving. It's very beautiful. Thank you. I think grand storytelling I think for me, music is less entertainment and more about the story. And, having people walk away being able to sort of dreamscape in their minds and picture what I was picturing. That's sort of the concept for me as a composer. Not as much just sort of lay back and vegetate, but more like I'd like to take you on a journey for a few moments. Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned a few things about, where you grew up and everything. Tell me a little bit more about your background family-wise. How did you, what are some of the influences you bring from that aspect of it? Sure. Growing up, my dad was a carpenter. They were not musical at all. Wow. So there wasn't a lot of music, but I started playing trumpet in 4th grade and just started writing kind of immediately before I even knew how to write music or read music. I just it just seemed natural. And then my parents bought an old piano for my sister. My grandfather got it for $50 from a bar. And so when my sister wasn't around, I would take her music books and I would just sort of look at what she was doing in her lessons. And I taught myself to play just by looking at her music books. And she eventually found out she wasn't really happy about it. And then she quit. And then so I started taking music lessons probably around junior high on the piano. Yeah.
Wow. Well, it seems like the entire process in watching the film of creating this music was an experience for you that it was almost visual, right? I mean, in terms of how you see music. Talk a little bit about that and how the process of coming to some of these compositions.
Well, I'm a synesthete, so I have synesthesia. So when I hear music, my mind translates it into color. So I hear in color. And and I'm not completely, it's sort of on the autism scale a little bit. So I'm not completely flaky. It actually is a thing that I'm sure some people are familiar with. So when I write music, I write with a program that allows me to categorize the orchestras by the colors that I see in my mind. The strings have a color, percussion, they all have various colors. So the way I see it in my mind, I'm able to write it out and I actually see it on a physical screen, which really, really helps. So I'm not necessarily approaching it from a music theory standpoint, which, would be the typical academic way to approach music. And I encourage my students never to do that. Even as a professor, I teach the music theory and then I tell them to forget everything I've taught them. And because it literally destroys the writing process. That's how I approach it, but I'm extremely visual. And with the symphony, I started downloading a man named Jerry Malzahn. He's an American painter of landscapes, and he's got works in the White House and just amazing painter, sort of Hudson River style. And I started using his paintings, honestly, as the inspiration. I posted them. I downloaded them and posted them all over the studio.
Wow.
And used that really to start writing the symphony.
Wow. Well, I'm going to get to that part because there's a whole nother rest of the story to that I think we need to talk about a little bit. But Steve, when you hear Charles talk about composition that way, and the cinematography in the Portraits of Colorado film is so powerful, is so good. How does the music influence your cinematography and your looking at the visual images that go along with that?
It's interesting because when Charlie got this commission to write the symphony from the Colorado Symphony that says, would you write a modern symphony based on the beauty of the Rockies? And he called up and he said, hey, would you think about engaging with this project and maybe do a film? To me, it was a no-brainer. We love Colorado. We're in Colorado for similar reasons. We're here for lifestyle. Really, I'm a film guy. I should be in New York or L.A., but I decided, if I can figure out how to do that here, I'll take half the money for twice the life, right? So, we all had a built-in love of the mountains and the beauty around us, and so I felt like that was a no-brainer. And then Charlie at that point had not really started writing, but he's sort of describing how he sees the mountains and how, behind it, this movement of creation where God is forming all of this beauty. And, even though it's instrumental music, I think when it's God-breathed, people feel the touch and work of the Holy Spirit. Because all these gifts that we have, whether you're an artist or whether you're an academic or whether you're something else, all these gifts are God's gifts that he's given to you, and some people have acknowledged him as the giver of those gifts, and some haven't. But they're all given freely, and I loved Charlie's sensibilities. We'd work on a couple of films together, so I knew it'd be a good project. But I knew part of what we had to do was to spend about a year in the mountains of Colorado and follow all 4 seasons because there's so many looks here. And so summer, Colorado's got its own incredible beauty with the flowers, the wildflowers in the mountains. I mean, summer's my favorite time. Then you go to winter, and you got the wonderful definition that the snow provides on the mountains and the depth. So winter's my favorite time. And then there's the fall, and you got the aspen leaves, and I've got a house at 10,000 feet. We're in the middle of these aspens. They're on fire and it's beautiful. So the fall's my favorite time. And then spring is also sort of this renewal coming out of the snow, and that moment where fresh life bursts forth, and that's so symbolic. So
yeah,
it's all my favorite time. And so I just thought, what we'll try to do is hear where Charlie's going with these songs, because there's a flow to the songs. And one of the songs where it's called Where Wild Horses Run, which I think Charlie was probably the least confident in as a composer. Back then, I think you probably changed your view, correct me if I'm wrong, since then. But,
True.
I saw this, I had good visuals of horses we shot from helicopters and stuff. So I had really great visuals there, but I loved that song. And I think it just came out to be a great moment in the film that just kind of gets you to go take a deep breath and go, oh, that's just gorgeous.
Concur. It's one of the most uplifting and soul-stirring visuals, as well as the music. The combination, just again, literally, we were joking before we went on the podcast, and every time I watch it, I could watch it again and again and again, and listening and putting it on a big sound system in my house. My wife is always like, "Can you turn it down a little bit?"
Could I interject just
please. Yeah.
It is funny about that movement, because I was going to throw that movement out. And I just thought, it's too literal. The melodies are too predictable. And I tried to keep the symphony very unpredictable, maybe to a fault. But it was funny, during the recording sessions, we had this unbelievable trumpet player. But anyhow, I wrote the piece more toward a film with that in the back of my mind, where I can walk in and they can blast the highest note that I put on there, because they're used to commercial music. Well, the classical orchestra, it's a different beast. And so during the recording, I had that part is so high, and I had it written for C, trumpet in C, and it just wasn't happening. And so, and I felt really bad for Justin during the session, because obviously I'd written it too high, and so I was trying to curve back and trying to figure out, what do I do to pull back on this? And so we ended up not recording the trumpet part, which is the sort of the main part of that particular movement, and we experimented, and I had Justin come over to my studio, and first we tried flugelhorn. That didn't work, and then finally we tried piccolo trumpet, and that's what you're actually hearing on the recording, is this piccolo trumpet, and he just flew with that. That was just, it was sort of amazing. But for me, that was, I felt terrible that I had caused somebody to just not be able to be their best during the session. But then the magic came later with Justin, and I love the track.
Yeah. The idea that this was a modern American symphony as well was also really fascinating to me. What is a modern American symphony?
Somebody writing music that's not dead. That helps.
That helps.
You know what? I don't know, because some of the real classical connoisseurs have hated me because I dared call it a symphony, and some have loved the idea that I called this a symphony. So honestly, time is this awesome thing, because time will vote, and people will vote. In 100 years from now, we'll know if it truly was an American modern symphony. But like with any composer, I mean, they hated Brahms, they hated Bach, they hated all of them. The critics ripped them apart, and then time will prove. But what makes it modern? That's a good question. I broke it into 10 movements rather than 3 or 4 movements, because who wants to listen to a 20-minute piece of music? And we're, with iPods and radio. I mean, radio doesn't want to play a 20-minute piece of music because they can't program commercials.
Right.
So why why would I write a symphony that was doomed to fail?
Right.
And I know in the academic world, they're still teaching people, well, you write it this way, you write this, and you develop this, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, well, that's ridiculous. We're teaching students to fail. We have to write in the language that people are commercially buying into. And so the idea of writing the way Brahms would write a symphony was completely ridiculous and would be audacious of me from an academic standpoint. This would just be sort of me writing something to please the connoisseurs. But this symphony was not written for them. It was written for everyday people.
It struck me also when I was watching this and I was listening to, the sort of descriptions about how the many movements and all of those things that were put into this were unconventional. I was reminded of the movie Amadeus. Remember Amadeus?
Oh, yeah.
And of course, there's Mozart and there's Salieri. And of course, it's been over-dramatized. And Salieri was a fine composer, a great composer in many ways. But the premise was he was the master. And here is this prodigy who comes in with something so over-the-top different and so counter to everything that was being done. That's the kind of impression I got from listening to Portraits of Colorado, that this was so fresh and it was yet so tapped into the way we listen to music today. How do we listen to music? You mentioned iPods and radio and various other things, shortcuts, but also cinema scores for movies and for the productions. My kids will talk about, the soundtrack to Dark Knight, and any Hans Zimmer, kind of soundtrack. And I remember my son being just a little kid with the Star Wars theme. Here's John Williams, a composer.
Yep.
And my son is dun dun dun, and I'm thinking, this is not rock and roll. This is the way he hears music. He hears it through the combination of those things. So again, bravo, as they would say in the theater. Bravo. It was really, really exciting to get to there. So you guys have worked together before. You'd worked together before this project. What were some of those other projects like?
The first thing was Gentle Bear Man of Emo, which I described earlier, which is when we first met. And that was, it's interesting. So being in my shoes and being in Charlie's shoes, somehow he's got to get into my brain to try to figure out what do I want or what's my feel.
That was a nightmare too. I was swimming around in there and I said, God, this is not the way it's supposed to be.
It's like a seizure at all times and you're trapped in a thunderstorm you can't get out of. So the way that he does that, which is kind of instructional, is we would cut the timeline and then I would put in library music out of what we would pull that I liked, and that would give a sense of the emotional connection we were going for. And then he would completely replace the music, not sounding like any of the library music with all new compositions, but captured that emotional connection that was in place and the way we used it. So, I think that was probably the most efficient way he could sort of get into my brain and figure that out. But the other side of the coin is I had historically been very reluctant to use live composers because of this very problem. And there's sort of nuanced communication that's challenging. And, I come from a music background. My parents are both musicians. My mom's a music teacher in theory. I grew up, like Charlie, playing the trumpet and then in bands later in life and married to a musician as well. So, I had the language of music down, but there's still a bridge to cross to get that perfect fit, that perfect relationship. So we did, the second thing we did was I did a film called The Master Designer, and Charlie wrote the major theme for that, and we ended up flying to Prague and working with the Prague Symphony on that one, and that was a great experience because here was a symphony that was really good at capturing sort of romantic and that kind of feel. They were a great symphony, but the expression and emotional stuff, I think, that was their forte. We work with Denver, which is also technically a very good symphony, maybe better for highly technical kind of playing. Prague was just gorgeous. And True. Prague was filled with people that didn't have $200,000 violins. They were taking the subway to the session and getting paid pennies compared to what an American. And yet it was just a great time. We took Scott O'Neill, who had become a friend, who was the in-house conductor for the Colorado Symphony, and he came along and conducted the sessions.
Right, yeah.
And it was fun to see that symphony, which plays film score after film score. If you looked in the lobby of this place, most of the American movies that you've seen, they're the ones that they cut the score there.
Wow.
And at the end of the session or at the end of a piece, they would take their bows or their violins and tap the stand, which in classical polite speak is, we hear a lot of stuff, but this is really good.
This is really good.
So they gave a lot of high praise to Charlie, which was sweet to see,
Well,
They're a great orchestra. And I think, that's the thing, is passion. When you go to like a European orchestra here, we're post-communism, and, they're trying to figure out, okay, how does this work now? How do I make a living? So they're incredibly grateful for the work. And no, they don't have $100,000 violins. They've got like these $5,000, $6,000 instruments. But the passion is amazing, and it does come out in their music.
Yeah, that's remarkable, and such a profitable collaboration between you guys. With your film and music background, and your composing and music scores that have that touch a deep nerve. I love to see the combination of these things. So go into a little bit. You talk a little bit about in the film, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the inspiration for doing this project in the first place. I mean, that wasn't your bread and butter. I mean, this had to come from somewhere.
Yeah, no, the bread and butter has very little to do with the classical stage. Commissions are, it doesn't pay what film and television pay, but there's a passion there. And I had started working on a piece which became Moment at Dawn, and I'd been toying with the idea of a symphony about Colorado and the Rocky Mountains. At the time, I was working on a film with Richard Gere called Henry and Me, and in the film, we're working with the Yankees and Steinbrenner when he was alive, and Cyndi Lauper was played a nurse. It was an animated film, and just a beautiful film. And the Colorado Symphony wanted to premiere the score live, and have the film playing, and Scott O'Neill was going to conduct live. Well, unfortunately, they went bankrupt that fall, and so their concert series was canceled. And so I said, "Hey, well, I'm writing a symphony. Would that help you guys? Is that something that would?" And they said it would, because Colorado Tourism would like some music written about Colorado. They want to create this campaign and record it with the Colorado Symphony, and so that tied in, and it funded me writing the symphony. They officially commissioned it. Colorado Tourism was so gracious and taking care of the finances. And it actually, for Colorado Tourism, it was very financially beneficial for them. And according to the Denver Post, it was the most successful campaign in the history of Colorado Tourism. And they actually brought in $1.8 billion of new tourism money as a direct result.
Billion.
Of 1.8 billion with a B as a direct result of the campaign. So it helped Colorado out, which was neat for me. And here I'm writing a symphony about Colorado, and the money is filtering into the mom and pop shops and all of the tourism and the ski slopes, and that was kind of rewarding.
Sure. Well, so much of this is Colorado, and so much of it just really are the very, very best parts of Colorado, both musically and visually. Steve, how did you look at some of the shots? I mean, did you listen to the pieces and then think about which shots you were going to take? Because I'll just say right now, the scene of the elk, the little baby elk.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Jumping.
Oh, my gosh.
I've
never seen anything like that.
I've never seen anything like it either, and I watch a lot of nature documentaries.
Yeah. And it's just great because this baby elk wanders into this little pond, and literally just starts kicking up its heels in joy and leaping, and water splashing everywhere. And this little elk's having the time of his life, And we just, when you go out and shoot, you don't know like when these moments will happen. These are sort of the gifts that are given to us in those moments. And so we were able to capture some wonderful gifts in this film. So I had time, because when Charlie got the music done, I had time with it. It took us much longer to get the film done. So I had time to ruminate with it, and we were working on still different seasons of the year and Cruising the Mountain and all that stuff. And so, it was a matter of just finding the right, it's a feel thing for me. I couldn't teach it, and there may be somebody else could teach it, but I can't. But there's that process where it's in your gut and it's touching. It's the beauty element.
It's inspiration.
And to me, when the project was done, it caught me a little bit by surprise because it was so well liked. I've done more technical kinds of projects that were harder in some sense, but this was just a joyride. And then we get nominated for a Grammy last year for Best Music Film. And we get all this attention from other outlets to say, we like this film. Of course, everybody also likes Colorado, right? So who doesn't like Colorado?
Yeah,
true. And so it was sort of our love letter to Colorado. We
it sure
write
is
something
that.
to say we love.
One thing that we touched on was your process of writing this and the inspiration that came to you through this. Talk about Jerry Malzahn and the artwork and how that process came about.
So, as I'd mentioned earlier, I was downloading his work. I had met him a while back. We had bought our King Charles Cavalier from his wife. His wife raised them, and just a wonderful dog. So I'd met him briefly, and then just sort of forgot about it. I saw some of his paintings. They have a gorgeous second home in southern Colorado. So I remember that sort of Hudson River style, which is the way the colors sort of jump out and the various hues. And I just looked him up when I started writing, and I started printing it out. And I ended up giving him a call after I'd printed up 5 or 6 of his paintings and plastered them around the studio. I just felt like I needed to call him. And I called him, reminded him of who I was. I'm not sure he remembered, but I reminded him that we had bought the dog and made that connection. And I told him I'd been downloading his paintings and plastering them, and I hope that's okay.
Kind of felt a little guilty, probably.
I was feeling very guilty. And I'll never forget, his response was, well, that's amazing because I've been listening to your music as inspiration for my paintings. And so that was an amazing connection, which turned into a wonderful friendship. And his paintings were at the premiere, and his paintings are in the film. His paintings are, in the album and the liner notes. And he sent me 2 paintings from movements that I'd written directly as a result of his paintings. Just a wonderful friendship, and he's just salt of the earth. Of course, we lost him. This summer. He was in his 70s, and but wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man.
And he's a great American artist whose paintings are in Washington D.C. in the White House and in the Naval Academy.
The Naval Academy.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a remarkable testimony to the divine weaving of inspiration. I like to think that here's 2 artists in 2 different genres who randomly connect.
Sure, yeah.
And yet randomly is never random.
No.
But whose work mutually inspires each other. And I think the formation of that as a film has been really one of the singular achievements. It's just a tremendous work. Obviously, I think the state of Colorado has benefited from it pretty greatly. Are there plans or there performances of this as a complete work that you're in touch with? Are there things like that happening right now?
We did have Scott O'Neill took one of the movements,
and he's the conductor.
The conductor,
and symphony head of the Denver Symphony.
He was the resident conductor,
right. And
he's premiered variations of the work, but no plans to sort of play it again. In the classical world, they don't like repeats unless you're dead, and then they definitely repeat it. So it's sort of a strange thing.
We don't want that to happen anytime soon.
No. I wouldn't be able to make it to the premiere.
Although we're both kind of looking at a trip to Asia this fall. And, what's interesting is we have sort of a film that's timed out exactly with the music. So one of the ideas we're sort of pinging around, we don't know how this will play out, would be to project the film and let the orchestra sync to it. And so you've got this combination of powerful visuals and music, sort of double impact. And, I think some of these ideas are the future of the genre. Because when you look at sort of young people that are under 30, They're not going to the symphony. And yet, at the same time, they're going to films. And like you said, so orchestral music they love it. They're connecting with it, but not symphonic music and the old masters necessarily. Sure. That's too sophisticated and too old school for them at this stage of their life. So the bridge music, I think, which Charlie's involved in, will be an important piece that will open the door to people discovering the experience of live, unmiked music in great halls where the symphony can do their thing. And it's a great experience to have if you've never been. But, hopefully we'll see more and more of this kind of bridge stuff. And I know Scott O'Neill has been hit up by a symphony recently in Colorado that's all they want to do. So I think there's bright days ahead. And, of course, Scott became a good friend for both of us. We spent a year in pre-production of this project. Most of those meetings were at a classic, beautiful old hotel in Denver called the Brown Palace. And,
yeah, sure.
Scott and Charlie and I spent hundreds of hours together.
And hundreds of dollars.
And eating the fabulous
good food
of the
That's
Browns.
Right, yes.
But it was interesting. It was not without obstacles. We got to a point where it was time to shoot one of the performances, the live performance, and I had negotiated with the symphony, and we had our deal in place. And literally, I've sent my guys out to pick up sort of thousands and thousands of dollars of rental gear plus our gear. We've got personnel pegged. We've got 7 cameras, so we probably got 13 people of crew. And I get a last-minute call, 5 p.m., from a couple of the guys in the symphony, which are in management, that want to change the deal. Well, I'm not going for it. So I said, listen, guys, it's the night before, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you 15 minutes to decide if you want to move ahead or change the deal. And then if I don't hear from you, I'm pulling the plug, right? So I pulled the plug that night. And we went back to the drawing board. Well, of course, this led essentially to the firing of this executive at the symphony, which I wish him well. I don't wish him bad things. And then we sort of got lost in a new administration discussion. And meanwhile, we've been planning all this for months and months and months. So I get a call one day from the new chairman of the board, who was, I think, the biggest donor of the symphony. And he used to manage Playboy Enterprises. And so he called me in. I even put on a sport jacket for this meeting, to be respectful, and I drive down. So I go into his office, and he says, so what is this, what's this talk about this project you guys are all talking about? And, I gave him the backstory, and, he's a button pusher kind of guy. And he looks at me and he goes, what if I said we didn't give a F, right? So pushes the buttons. I start laughing, and I go, well, let's just go to Seattle. And then another guy in the room pipes up and goes, well, our symphony's better than Seattle. Now the competition has begun. Anyway, we got through it all and connected and had an arrangement, and it worked out. But, these obstacles happen, and people see the finished product. They have no idea the journey, but sometimes the journey's fantastic and weird.
I was just about to say that. The story behind the story is so fascinating on top of that. And, as a work of art, they just don't happen.
Yeah.
And those obstacles and overcoming them and the various other ones, it's just great. I did have one other question before I ask my last kind of question, but Charles, what caused you to think about doing this with choral? There's a big chorus, not common for both of those things to be written into a work like that.
True. Yeah, you usually don't hear a choir in a symphony, and symphonic and classical music has to evolve, and it hasn't. The mainstay for symphonies all across the United States, not as much in Europe. Europe is much more progressive than the United States. The mainstay is, we will resurrect the masterworks. We will keep Bach alive. We'll call it Brewskis with Bach, or we'll call it basking with Beethoven. But we're going to play the same thing over and over and over again. And so they're calling those masterworks, when the reality is a John Williams or your film score work, which is written for film and television, is much more complicated, much more sophisticated than Beethoven or Brahms, who they start in 4/4, they end in 4/4, they start in the key of C minor, they end in the key of C minor. Whereas with a film score, you're going to start in C minor and you're going to modulate all the way up to G minor, and you're going to do that in 10 measures, and you're going to have 5 or 6 different time changes within those 10 measures. Much more complicated.
I have no idea what that means, but it sounds very complicated.
Much harder, much more sophisticated. In today's audience that are going into theaters and they're hearing orchestral music, because America loves orchestral music. They just don't like classical music. So please don't call it classical. But what they're hearing is incredibly complicated. And then they walk into a concert hall and they hear, Beethoven's Fifth again. And it's predictable, and it's not to say this isn't good stuff. It's great stuff, and we do need to preserve it, but we need to let it evolve. And the classical music audience and the American classical experience needs to start embracing this, or they will go bankrupt. They will not be in business. So when I wrote my symphony, I was writing it for the people, not for the classical audience. And people are used to going to theaters and hearing these dark choirs singing in Latin, and they're used to hearing these brooding basses and this undergird that you don't hear in the masterwork. So I wanted this symphony to reflect the tastes of the American people, not necessarily the classical establishment.
So well done. So important. And I love the fact that the voices were included because I don't play an instrument, but I do love to sing. And part of me was saying, where's the voice of the people of Colorado? And when some of those scenes were highlighted by the soaring, chorus in the background, I was like, oh, this is where my soul sings. So again, thank you, Charles. This was such an amazing experience. I encourage anyone often to watch this and to listen and to understand just what a miraculous and beautiful world we live in particularly the state of Colorado. So
Amen.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks,
Amen.
Steve.
You bet.
Appreciate you guys both being here. Really, really, it's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this edition of the Exploration Films podcast. Check out Portraits of Colorado, as well as our full library of documentaries and independent feature films at explorationfilms.com. This one is available digitally everywhere.
That's a wrap. You've been listening to the Exploration Films podcast. explorationfilms.com.